this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Friday. Kick off the Winter Olympics in style with the opening ceremony from Italy, featuring a special performance by Mariah Carey. Celebrate the greatest athletes from around the globe as they come together to go for gold.
Lindsey Vonn, sensational!
The opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics.
Ilya Malinin. Redefining the sport.
Friday at 8 Eastern, 7 Central on NBC and Peacock.
Body Bags with Joseph Scott Morgan. There are many sayings that we have that have entered into our lexicon over the years, and many times we never really fully appreciate the origin of these common quotes, if you will. There's one that stands out in mind to me because when I was a little kid, I never really understood it, but you would hear it with some frequency. And when I got in high school and had to take literature classes, I kind of discovered the origin of it. And it's actually from Act 5 of William Shakespeare's play, Richard III. And I bet you many of you have heard it. Here it goes. You ready? I'm going to, let's see if I can do my best voice, theatrical voice. Here we go. You ready? A horse, my kingdom for a horse. Well, those words, according to Shakespeare, were allegedly uttered by Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth field. This is after his horse had apparently gotten swamped in the mud. He's off of the back of the horse in armor, swinging a saber or maybe a mace or maybe a battle axe. And the enemy is swarming about him like bees. It's on that location that perhaps, as per Shakespeare, one of the most sinister figures to ever occupy the throne of England died. But here's the trick. What happened to him? For almost 500 years, no one actually knew. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags. Dave, I had a surreal moment. I guess it was probably about, let me think.
Hey, Joe, let me butt in here while you take a minute to try to remember that, because this whole story is right in Joe Scott Morgan's wheelhouse. For the rest of us, we might need to do a little catching up. Richard III was born October 2nd, 1452. He was King of England from June 26, 1483 until his death on the battlefield, August 22nd, 1485. He was king for just over 2 years. His defeat and death at the Battle of Bosworth field marked the end of the Middle Ages in England. After the battle, his remains were paraded through town as there had to be proof that he was dead, and his body was treated with as little respect as possible. Now, historians believed his body had just been tossed in a nearby river. His remains were lost, possibly on purpose, for 5 centuries. However, on today's episode of Body Bags, we're going to take you on a trip through time to the battlefield where Richard III was killed, to the more recent stories about where his remains would be found. And now that we've found the remains, we can determine what caused his death. I'm not kidding. Joseph Scott Morgan is going to use history and current science to determine what actually happened on the battlefield that caused the death of Richard III. Okay? Now, Joe, have you been able to remember when you had your surreal moment?
I guess it was probably about 1.5 years ago. Now, you know, as you well know, you're my buddy. You know where I work full time. You know where Daddy has to go to keep the lights on, right? And I work over at Jacksonville State University, and we've been in a building. The Criminal Justice Department of Forensic Science has been in a building probably for the last 50 or 60 years. It's the same space we always occupied. And just, I mean, like within the last last semester, we moved into a new building, and it's one of the oldest buildings on campus, but we've repurposed it. We've got like a crime scene house and all this stuff, but I'm not so much interested in what's contained in this new house as to what's on the facade, because I got to tell you, I had a moment, and since we're talking about something that happened in British history, I was actually gobsmacked, as the Brits like to say. I looked up at the facing, the archway covering the door, and on either side of the door, there are 4 Tudor roses. And I almost recognized them immediately because we've talked about it before. I think I like to do genealogy. And my mother's side of the family, who her last name is Edwards, we were able to trace our family history back to Wales. And the family lore is that we descend from one of Henry VIII's illegitimate trysts, and that side of the family. And so when I'm going into this new space to occupy, and there are Tudor roses outside the building, I'm thinking, what are the odds that this could happen? And this plays into the story of Richard III, because it was as a result of his death that the Tudors came to power. And you had the House of Lancaster that had a red rose, and you had the House of York that had a white rose, and they combined them both and made the Tudor rose. And so I've always been fascinated by the story, by the play, but more so, Dave, this case in modern times has really captured the imagination of people from all over the world. And it solved one of the biggest mysteries, arguably, from medieval history. I don't know. It's been a heck of a ride, just kind of following the case all the way along.
Having a play written about you by, after you're dead, and that living on more than the history they teach, especially in the United States, where, our educational background is not as strong as it ought to be.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to these types of things. But okay, with Richard III, I look at it and I know the play, and I know he's painted as a villain, and I've read some of the propaganda that is taught as fact, but I don't believe a lot of it. I'm not saying he's a good guy or a bad guy or anything else, because I don't know. It was 500 plus years ago. We're talking about, in the 1450, the guy was 32 when he died, right?
Yeah, he was 32 when he died at Bosworth.
And you look at the whole chain of command there, from how he actually became king. Yeah. And it was not a long reign. It was not a happy reign.
No.
It was a coup d'etat that led to him dying on the battlefield. But there was something you mentioned to me right before we started that I didn't know.
Right.
Well, there was enough information about finding his body, because I'll be honest, Joe, I didn't know it was missing. Okay. No clue until I started reading the stories. It's probably close to 8 or 9, 10 years ago now, where they talked about how they were able to locate where his body is.
Fascinating
and it's like
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm like, we can't find people, that are 10 years gone. Yeah. You're talking about hundreds of years, and a guy that kind of died in ill repute. Then he's a villain. Nobody cares about him in a good way enough to look for him. But you mentioned something to me, because on the battlefield at his death, the guy died on the battlefield as a king.
Let me tell you this. He was actually, here's a bit of trivia. He was actually the last English king to die in battle.
There you go. Didn't know that, but I couldn't think of another one that had, since him.
Right.
But when you think about that, and this is what I meant before we started taping, I was asking Joe, I'm an American through and through. When you mentioned Lancaster a minute ago.
Yeah.
I know Lancaster Avenue in LA. I know in North Hollywood. I know right where that is. No problem, man. But you start mentioning things like that happen in Great Britain. I know you're going there this fall.
Yeah, you're going to be there UK. CrimeCon, UK.
Which is really exciting. And I'm hoping that you'll, be able to send us some pics back and some really cool stuff of you walking around at, Big Ben and everything else. But the bottom line, always being the bottom line, is this is body bags. And in this particular case, they didn't know where the body was to put in the bag. They didn't know what condition the body would be in when they found it, if they found it.
Yep.
And where they found Richard III boggles my mind.
Yeah, it was.
And how they found him.
Yeah, and it sent shockwaves literally all through Great Britain. But here's the other thing too. You know how I was talking about my own genealogy?
Right.
There is an organization out there, and I dig this. It's called the Ricardian Association or the Ricardian. I can't remember. Anyway, no disrespect to them because I'm sorry.
The Ricky Ricardo in.
No, not the Ricky. It's the Ricardian association or organization. Anyway, these people they view themselves, well, first off, there's a core group that believe that they are descended from Richard's line. Okay. And he had sisters and all this sort of thing, which we'll get into in a little bit. But they have always held that something wasn't right with the story. And as you well know, and we've heard this time and time again, the victor gets to write the history. Yep. And here's one thing that we do. One of the ways that back during these times, obviously very few people were literate, but one of the ways, and this extends to the church, you had monks that were translating the Bible. This is before the Reformation. You had friaries everywhere, which is, going to come into play in this particular case. But they would illustrate things to the point where you could look at a portrait or a picture of something and get an idea. Did you know that that's like the origin of stained glass? When you go into a church and it's like you see the 12 apostles on that idea originated by virtue of the people that could not read Latin or couldn't read at all, and they could see it played out before them, the woman at the well and, so forth and so on. But for Richard, there's an interesting piece that came up in the discovery of this case. I would urge everybody to look up his portrait because it's ghastly. And this is like the official portrait, and they have it hanging in the National Gallery in Great Britain. And Dave, he was known as the Hunchback King. And when you see let's see, what's his name? The famous Igor. No, it's not Igor. Who's the famous Sir Laurence Olivier? He played him, and a movie portrayal. And when you see him, he's all contracted. He leans to one side. He has a noticeable hump in his back. But the portrait itself demonstrates that. But you know what else the portrait painter did, Dave? When you look at the fingers, they look like claws. They come to little points where his fingernails would be. So they really went they went all in on this case to try to portray him as evil. And I've often found that when people that are in control try to portray somebody as purely evil, that is a statement about the individual that's doing the portrayal. That maybe not everything they're about is just, but
sound like American politics these days.
Yeah, exactly. It sounds like worldwide politics, actually. Yeah. And hey, what have we said before, Dave? You and I. There is nothing new under the sun. This was going on back then. It was going on before then, and it's really kind of fascinating. But what's even more fascinating is the fact that after all these many years, they were finally able to locate the mortal remains of a monarch of England. And when I tell you this, you're not going to believe where they found it.
Friday. Kick off the Winter Olympics in style with the opening ceremony from Italy, featuring a special performance by Mariah Carey. Celebrate the greatest athletes from around the globe as they come together to go for gold.
Lindsey Vonn, sensational!
The opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics.
Ilya Malinin.
Redefining this sport.
Friday at 8 Eastern, 7 Central on NBC and Peacock.
I think many folks think that their death is going to be peaceful. There's no way, to predict any of this stuff. The lion's share of us are going to die of some kind of natural event. Okay. That brings us in. I think that kind of begs the question, is there actually a good death? Well, Dave, I got to tell you, the death that Richard III, his death was not a good death. It was a death that took place on a medieval battlefield, and this is not an environment where you have cannons and guns and you're shooting people at long distances. This is horses that are screaming, literally, because they're being attacked. You've got men that are screaming, the clank of armor, the strikes of all kinds of weapons, which we can get into, heavy bladed weapons, blunt weapons, and it's just total chaos in this environment. You know what has always fascinated me, Dave, relative to this kind of battlefield? Because I'll look at like battlefield images from the Civil War, and I got to tell you, some of them are very organized looking. You know that a line of men went down in one particular location. You're talking about this. People are commingled together. Enemies are laying on top of enemies. Right. And it was, to say that it was a good death, I think would be certainly an understatement of what happened there on the field of Bosworth.
Well, we've got a king leading his people into battle, and he's the target. You want to take out the most senior commander on the field. You're going to skip over all of the other pawns out there to get to that guy.
Dude,
everybody on the field.
Yeah, you're showing up, man. I mean, and I got to hand it to him. When you think about it, and I know that we're talking about, the world that we have, this very kind of, I use the word clean in politics as a stretch, but it's very clinical. Mm-hmm. When you think about that a president can sit in a war room somewhere and watch a big screen and you can see your enemies eliminated at a distance. That's not what went on with Richard. It's not what went on with any of these people back then. They showed up. They were out there and they were at the head of their troops many times. And that would rally their own troops. If they could see the king and see their colors, because that's why they carry flags, have a purpose.
Right.
You know the king's flag, where he is, you're going to defend him, all that sort of stuff. But here in this particular battle, where you've got the House of Lancaster and the House of York, which was actually Richard's house, they're like, I don't want to get too deep into this, but just so that you understand, everybody understands, they both originate from a big house in France called the Plantagenets, and they're what are called cadet branches. So these two branches have come off, and now they're clashing. They're clashing against one another. They want power, and like you said, Richard didn't have a solid inner circle, and there's always what they call palace intrigue going on. Yeah. Everybody's trying to stab one another in the back, and of course, in this particular case, that's almost literally what happened out on the battlefield.
Right.
Quite fascinating stuff.
And here we are all these years later, immediately following the battle. Okay, he dies in battle. And I thought, and I mean this, Joe, I really thought that in order for there to be a transition of power, you have to know that the king is dead. Because there has to be, and just like after a battle, there has to be proof of life.
Right.
If he's injured or whatever, they have to say he's still alive, he's still in control. Well, in this case, in order to move the country forward to past leadership, you have to prove he's dead. And the fact that we didn't know where his body was, indicates something different to me. It means something, and I'm not sure. Did we just kind of lose sight of it after Shakespeare writes the play and he's the evil guy and nobody cares?
They knew that. Listen, they knew, and there were accounts at that time that confirmed that he had in fact died. And just so you know, the guy leading the other army was actually a guy named Henry Tudor. Henry Tudor ascends to the throne and becomes Henry VII, and he is the father of Henry VIII and the grandfather of Elizabeth I.
Yeah,
there you go. You're absolutely right. And so he he is that person that has to find the remains of Richard III in that messy muck that's out there. They have to take him back to town so that all the citizenry are the closest place. The biggest location where they could take Richard's body back to was the town of Leicester. And it was a thriving town. And it was, I don't know, it was over 10 miles away from the battlefield.
Wow.
I would imagine probably back during that time, we didn't have a lot of ambient noise back during that period of time in our history. You probably could have heard the battle off in the distance and people moving around. The citizenry probably knew, but
didn't they go and watch those things? I thought
they would, but you didn't know what they were gathering for. And also, if you're a peasant,
right,
you don't exactly get time off.
Oh yeah, that's true.
But here's the fascinating thing, Dave, that what they did with Richard's body.
Okay.
Between the time that they took Richard off of the battlefield and took him to where he could actually be witnessed by the citizenry, his body, they stripped his body.
Oh.
They took all of his clothing off, his armor, everything. We suspect that his helmet fell off in battle. That's revealed in some of the wounds that we're going to talk about in just a bit. But here's a key point. They actually state, and really hold on to this, that the death of Richard III was actually the death of chivalry. And we've heard of, the chivalry, how they courted and how they wouldn't unnecessarily wound an enemy. And all of that went out the door. I submit to you that this might have been kind of the threshold that we cross over at that point in time where things suddenly become maybe a bit less refined.
Where they just said, enough's enough. This guy's disgusting. We're showing it to everybody.
Yeah, and they draped him. They allegedly draped him over a horse. So if you can imagine, and I don't even know that it was his horse. Remember, his horse had gotten bogged down in the mud.
He had to get off the horse.
Yeah, or fell off. We're not. Right. It's not really clear.
One way or another, he ended up off the horse.
He ended up, gravity. And you think about everything that I cannot imagine being encased in metal, riding a horse that's also probably encased in metal, and you're going out there, and all of this. It's such an effort to raise your arms and to carry these heavy weapons and to wield them against against an opponent. But they stripped everything that he had off of his body and strapped him down on a saddle, and they're leading him off. And this is the most degrading thing that one person that is the other side in one of these battles where you've got these houses that are fighting against these royal houses that are fighting. It's the ultimate in humiliation. And we talk about this in modern cases, Dave, don't we? We talk about what people do with bodies.
Right.
After they've killed, they'll completely desecrate a human remain. And again, back to our earlier touchstone, nothing new under the sun here.
Right.
And so they, after they strapped him to the saddle and led him down the road, they had to say, he is in fact dead.
Yeah.
Here he is. New boss is in town. And that's when Henry VII actually emerges at that point in time.
But that's where he actually becomes Henry VII, because without the death of Richard III, without them prancing him around town saying he is dead, he ain't coming back from this.
Yes.
Okay. Now, when you mentioned shaming him, that it was time to go overboard on this because he had a reputation that included incest, murder, killing a child. Everything you could possibly throw on one guy was thrown on Richard III. And I've always wondered how much of that was propaganda.
Yeah.
We have it now with our network television coverage of politics where they say things that are patently false and people believe it because they want to believe it.
Yeah.
Back then, it was no different. They had people reporting what was going on in the battlefield. We had it here during the Revolutionary War. They had reporters out on the field that were watching these and sending stuff back to the press.
Dispatches, yeah, absolutely.
And, it's all in how it's pushed out in the media. Think about it. During when you go ahead a couple of hundred years during World War II, do you realize between 1941 and 1945, Hollywood put out over 400 films about war, about the World War II, and about victory and the U.S. being the good guys. It was a propaganda war because you know what? If you see Saving Private Ryan landing on the beach and you see that as your future, you ain't signing up.
No, you're not. It's kind of the unvarnished version of it. It's interesting going back even further than that. General Sherman, who famously marched through Georgia and destroyed Georgia, and he's kind of the guy that came up with the idea of total war.
Right.
He was going to make the people in the South howl. He had more respect for his enemy than he did for reporters. Mm-hmm. He referred to them as those damn scribblers,
right, that
were essentially stealing information, and they would go talk to the common and then print it as fact. And so you never know what's coming out, and you can't control those things. But if you have, which I think you do, with the House of Tudor, they started this that day. At the Battle of Bosworth, they started a propaganda campaign that was methodical, and it continued on. Man, it continued on for 100 years, up until the time of Shakespeare and Elizabeth. She was the longest-serving monarch for a long, long time. So she had this in the back of her mind.
Oh, wow.
That it was going to delegitimize anybody else that had claim to the throne, the Plantagenets in particular, or Plantagenets, depending upon how you pronounce it. But they were still 100 years later, they're still trying to besmirch Richard III's life, his reign. And you know what? Sometimes you have to turn to the science to determine what exactly happened.
Friday. Kick off the Winter Olympics in style with the opening ceremony from Italy, featuring a special performance by Mariah Carey. Celebrate the greatest athletes from around the globe as they come together to go for gold.
Lindsey Vonn, sensational!
The opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics.
Ilya Malinin.
Redefining this sport.
Friday at 8 Eastern, 7 Central on NBC and Peacock.
Dave, when I say these weapons that they utilized back during this period of time were ghastly, and the injuries that they could create with them were ghastly, that's actually an understatement. I don't do it service completely because these things are, well, first off, dependent upon what station you held. And I mean, in society, these weapons were custom made. The king would certainly have his own custom made weapon. And then you had this force that was with Henry Tudor. Did you know many of these troops that he had were actually Welshmen, because that's where the Tudors arise from. They come up out of Wales. And so they had their own particular types of weapons that they entered into this battle. And here's one in particular that was used to great effect. They had something that was called a halbert. And some people might have heard of a pike before. It's a long stick that has a metal point on the end of it. Well, a halbert actually has an axe on the head of it, in addition to a pointy spike. So, this comes into play when Richard's remains are finally, after 500 years, finally assessed. But before we get to that point, we've got to get to this idea of how in the heck did they find Richard III's body? Here's what actually happened. There was a place in this town where they went to the cathedral, and it was actually called Grey Friars. And a friary is a place that has monks. Okay, so if you think about it, if you've never been to a cathedral in England, which I urge everybody to go to. This is prior to the Reformation, so these are all Roman Catholic churches. And most of the ancient churches in Great Britain are all Roman Catholic. They just, when the Reformation took place, per Henry VIII, he pulled down some of these things over the years, and Greyfriars was alleged at that time to be the place where Richard's body was taken, and he was probably buried, they thought, adjacent to the choir loft. And there was one published document back then that said, and I'm paraphrasing because it's written in language that we don't normally speak in, but essentially what it says, there was no pomp and circumstance, he was buried. Well, as time went by, this beautiful house of worship gets pulled down eventually, and is abandoned.
Right.
Now, Leicester it's a big town. It's an old town. There's a university there. I mean, and the university plays into the story, but they always had a sense that it was there. And over the period of time, there evolved this mythos with Richard's body that he had actually never made it there. He was taken into one of two rivers and dumped in the river, and his body was allowed to float away. And I found that really interesting in this case because those were not necessarily contemporary. Those were like 200 and 300 years later. So they had no idea, but isn't it fascinating that contemporary writers at that time had actually stated the truth? And this is where the Ricardian Association comes in. They had never bought this idea that Richard had just been tossed away.
Right.
And so they began to mount this effort. I think it was in like 2010 when this whole thing started. Mount this effort to try to find Richard. Well, the first thing they had to do, Dave.
Joe? Wait a minute. It went that long until 2010?
Yeah. The first thing they had to do was not find Richard's body. They had to find the church because they had no idea where the church was.
Wow.
And for people that have never seen these churches, these things are massive.
They're not small.
No, they're stone, and they're really resilient. Of course, they're framed out in wood and all that sort of stuff.
Except for the aliens coming and taking that stuff and moving it over to Stonehenge. That's what happened. Yeah.
But there's wood frames in it. I mean, we saw horribly what happened in Paris, a few years ago with Notre Dame, where it burned, the whole thing catches on fire. Right. So there's wood in there, but the stone edifice kind of stands. Well, the stones were pulled down. I mean, they were pulled down and and literally, time moved on and people forgot about it. Well, can you imagine?
Think about it. Joe, how many of our friends that are our children or their friends know who Jack Benny is?
Yeah. You're right.
Or Bob Hope.
Yeah.
Two of the biggest stars of the last 100 years.
Yeah.
Jack Benny died in the early 70s. Bob Hope just several years ago. I mean, think about it. They don't know. They have no clue. Three Stooges, they don't know.
No, they don't. And
we've lost our culture, Joe.
We have, and everything begins to fade over time. And it's that, listen, it's that way with everyone. But here's the curious thing. Kings are curious things in Great Britain because when you go to like Westminster Cathedral and you walk in that place and you see all of those tombs where going back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and you see the coronation throne that's there, that's behind this iron cage that they pull out when somebody is crowned. You see how ancient all of this stuff is, but you've got the missing body of a king, Richard III. Who knows what happened to him? They suspected that there were the social services department for the city of Leicester. They had a parking lot. This is so mind-blowing.
Come on, man.
They had a parking lot, dude.
I really thought that was a punchline. I really thought that
it's social services, man, and for the city, and they approximated the archaeologists that went out there from the University of Leicester, by the way.
Okay.
And these people had no money.
So they had to figure out where the church was, where it had been.
Yeah.
And then from there, they're using things that they don't even know are true. They're hoping.
Don't. Yeah. And so I don't even know how, like if you were to go out there and try to shoot this mathematically, where you're surveying the area, you don't even have a point.
No point
to
of reference.
Go off of.
Wow.
But here's the thing that'll send a chill up your spine. I don't know if this is divine intervention. I don't know if it's just dumb luck. I have no idea. But they had determined, I can't believe I'm about to say this. They had determined that one of the walls of the church, the friary, as it was called, ran through ran through the parking lot of social services. So what little money they have, they had to get permits from Great Britain, by the way, loves to make you get permits. You got to have a permit for everything. So you can imagine the hassle that was. So they wind up getting the permit to dig up social services parking lot. So they dug 2 parallel trenches. All right. And Dave, do you know where they put the shovel in first? Just imagine a parking spot with white lines, and there is one single parking spot in this parking lot that has a gigantic R painted in it, and it meant like reserved. But they said, we think that this is where we ought to start. They dug the trench down. They went 5 feet down, 5 feet, it's a couple of meters, or 1 meter plus some. They found 2 leg bones right out of the gate. And people have often said, well, I mean, this is an ancient place. History going back to the Romans occupied the spot. You could probably turn soil around this place. You're going to find something. That's not all they found. Because when they went into this grave and they began to dig out this area, the skeleton was positioned so that, let me get this straight, the head, and it still had a head, by the way.
Wow.
Was slightly turned, and it was at kind of an elevated position. And when you're excavating a site, you have to make note of how the body is positioned, because there might be other bodies in there. And sometimes it will give you the appearance, Dave, that you might be dealing with more than one set of remains. Mm-hmm. And again, this is a friary. Okay, so other people had been buried in this location, because if you were in the upper crust, they're going to bury you in the floor of the church. Just on a side, I remember when I took my kids to St. Louis Cathedral in New Orleans, and beautiful structures, the oldest Catholic parish in the U.S. And my kids got so unnerved because all of the previous archbishops are buried beneath the floor right by the altar. And wow. When they were little, they were looking down, and I'm like, yeah, well, the archbishops are buried here. Well, that's the way that it had always been done, for people that were members of the church, that were the hierarchy, and certainly the nobility. They're buried in the church. So by virtue of the fact that you have a body that's approximating the interior of the church, that's not going to be a peasant. Okay. Well, the legs are turned in such a way, there's a skull, but here's the kicker, Dave. Remember, how had Richard III been portrayed over all these years? What did I say earlier? You had mentioned the name Igor, I think.
Yeah, a hunchback.
This skeleton had severe scoliosis.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, severe. It was all, Dave, if you've never seen like true, I mean, like everybody has kind of, no one has a perfect spine. You can have a bit of scoliosis, but his spine was almost S-shaped.
Wow.
And it was so that it would give the appearance that, he was contracted in this way. But they also said that he had a withered limb. That was the other thing, kind of like a claw hand. Both the hands are there. They're not deformed at all. He did have scoliosis. Right. But, back then, based
Wait a
upon...
minute. So you're telling me that they go out there 500 years later, it's 2010, they start looking around and go, okay, we're in a parking lot and there's a big red R right here. Maybe it stands for Richard. Maybe it doesn't. But you know what? Let's go ahead and give it a try.
They did.
You got the guys out there and they're laughing, drinking. They're probably saying, hey, man, I'm going to meet you over at the pub in about an hour. We're going to be done with this. We'll make jokes about it. And they find a leg. And they found Richard. So they dug down and found Richard right then?
Right then.
He was the first guy they found?
The first guy that they found. And they start searching through this thing. The first thing they did is they brought out ground penetrating radar. Mm-hmm. And they ran it over the area, and they didn't really get a hit, but they saw something metallic below the body. Now hold on to your hat for this. This will give you an idea of how old this is. They ran it over. They got a hit that was adjacent to like one of his vertebral bodies. And as they begin to excavate the area, they pull this thing out, Dave, and there's a nail. And they thought maybe, it wasn't a nail. They thought it was an arrowhead, a metal arrowhead. It wasn't. It was actually a nail. And then they thought, well, did they casket him? Well, most of these people were buried, particularly royalty, were buried in lead caskets. There's no evidence of that. I don't even know if he was buried in anything. They may have just wrapped him in a shroud and thrown him in the ground. Guess what the point of origin that nail was? The Romans. We're talking about 1,000 years before that, and they happened when they put his body in the ground. They actually put it on top of a Roman nail. What are the odds? And so they didn't find any other artifacts immediately adjacent to King Richard's body. But what they did find was pretty ominous, because they knew real quick that, and they had a forensic anthropologist out there from University of Leicester. They had forensic anthropologists, they had archaeologists, which you need. This is so complex, Dave, to do one of these things, because you, first off, just to dig down to this level, when you think about the strata of the dirt and everything, just compression over the years, how many times do you think that they had repaved that driveway, that parking lot over the years?
Just the parking lot.
Yeah. And just laid, and can you imagine the weight? And it's like compressing down over all these. It is absolute dumb luck that they found this body. They were able, everything, and here's something that was kind of interesting. The body was missing the feet, but they think that the feet, there was construction that was, now you talk about dumb luck again, construction was done back during the Victorian era back then. So you're talking about like the late 1800s. Mm-hmm. They think that the equipment or shovels or whatever, they think they lopped the feet off and it got commingled with dirt and it didn't get any of the rest of the body.
Oh my goodness.
So, I mean, again, they missed this by like a millimeter, they could millimeter, not literally, but they missed it by a hair is what I'm saying. They were able to extricate these remains. And look, just because you've got a guy with a hunchback or scoliosis, it don't make him Richard III.
And I'm beginning to think that if I'm the guy leading this, I'm telling everybody, all right, everybody cool down. This could be the bum we had this could be any number of things.
Right.
But let's just move forward. How did the guy die? The guy in the grave, it's Richard III. How did they actually get him out and start examining his body? Because we only know what we've been told about the battle, and most of it was lies.
And it was, and he's got, when they get the skeleton back to University of Leicester, where they're going to do the examination, and they've got everything they need there. I mean, they've got everything from CAT scan to X-ray equipment. They've got an anthropology archaeological lab. Heck, they've even got a forensic pathologist at their disposal that is really good at recognizing sharp force injuries. So you're going to want, because we still deal with skeletons that have sharp force injuries. So nothing really changes, relative to do the assessment. They've got an entire team. But here's what's really fascinating. When they begin to dig into this, they start doing carbon dating and radiocarbon dating. And not just that, but they start doing isotope isolation in the bones. And here's what's really, really interesting. Whoever this person was had been living off of things like cranes, like the birds, swans, and there was one other bird that's like a real high-end kind of thing, and they'd been eating fish. That's not gruel. It's not porridge, or pottage. It's not porridge. They actually called it pottage. Pottage is something that the peasants ate, and it's like collections of like. But
this guy was eating good.
He was
something.
Yeah, they were able to determine he had been eating fish. I mean, and swan. It sounds really unpalatable to us, but if you had a swan back then to eat, it was like that's something that you would have at a big feast.
Okay.
And so he had been eating these things. They were able to actually pick that up in their examination. What's really kind of telling here, though, is when they begin to look at his skull, because they noted upwards of 10 to 11 insults that his body had sustained. Most of these injuries, they felt as though were perimortem or postmortem. And this is, remember, we have no soft tissue, Dave. No soft tissue. We're just talking about bone.
Right.
When we break a bone, or even our bone is cut, like has a groove cut in it, if say some horrible accident befalls you, bone becomes mottled after in life. If you recover from that, the bone, you probably have to go through some therapy and that sort of thing, but let's just say it doesn't get healed. It's going to heal on itself. So it takes on this kind of mottled appearance where you can see that repair is taking place. There was no evidence of that. And what was really one of the most horrible injuries that he sustained, if people will put their hand on the back of their head and find that kind of bulbous area, the occipital protuberance there was a sword slice that had taken place at the back of his head. Remember the guy that had written the history, he said the boar had its head taken off.
Right.
That wasn't the case. He was very accurate. The back of that means that he may have seen the body. It sliced off the back of his head. And based upon what the forensic pathologist said, you could actually have seen his brain.
Oh, wow.
And
so he's on the battlefield. He's lost his helmet. He's out in the dirt and the muck. He is getting capped. He's getting hit in the head.
Yeah, and they're saying that based on, and this is kind of fascinating, Dave, you had mentioned these multiple angles. Mm-hmm. This is very sad because he knew that the end was there. Some of these people, and maybe it's just over-the-top theatrics, but I don't know. Who knows? Yeah. Who knows what's in a man's heart? They said that the injuries were consistent with him perhaps having been on his knees and praying when he was killed in the battlefield, because he knew he was surrounded, he was defeated, and they're going to kill him. Right. And, you bow your head and turn it down, and the angle of these injuries that he had sustained, and not to mention that little nasty dagger that I was talking about, was probably driven through his head as well. The entire, the facial bones are gone. One aspect of the face is gone. It's been caved in. He still had teeth. They hadn't been knocked out. He had lost some teeth in life, and there was, some rot but that was expected at that point in time. But still, we have all of this information, and we know that this is probably a battle-related death, but we still can't confirm. Still can't confirm that it is, in fact, Richard III. Right. And let me tell you why this is so important. Elizabeth was still not Elizabeth I, but Elizabeth II. She was on the throne when all this was happening. Now, this is a very delicate political issue.
Yeah.
Okay. First off, there's the Church of England. Well, the Church of England was not always the Church of England. It was Catholic Church. Richard was Catholic. And so there was actually a fight as to where his body was going to be buried. Because, if they were going to give him last rites or do whatever they do, the idea was that they were trying to work all this out. And I got to tell you, the House of Windsor was really trying to keep their hands off of this as much as they possibly could. But they did eventually identify him, and get this, I think it was, they extracted DNA from a bone, and it was mitochondrial DNA, and they found 2 matrilineal lines. That means descending from Richard's mother that actually go through his sister, Anne. They found 2 living relatives. One was a 16th nephew, and the other was a 19th niece. I think I have those numbers right.
Wow.
The guy that they married this DNA up from at the skeleton with to confirm the ID, get this, talk about no longer being royalty. This guy's a carpenter.
Oh, wow.
Born in Canada, but he actually had a cabinet shop in London.
Oh, my goodness.
And they were actually, and this is not like, now, this is back in 12, I think.
Yeah.
When we get to this point, we didn't have forensic genealogy back then,
right,
like we do now.
Oh, yeah.
And so the thing about it is that the Brits, particularly when it comes to all these royals, they keep meticulous records on all of the descendants, ranging all the way back. I talked about how I'd done stuff relative to my line and all of that. It's very complex, but they have those records in place and they could figure out who they descended to. So they go to this guy, this cabinet maker of all people, and they do a buccal mucosal swab on him, Dave. Spot on match.
Oh, come on.
Yeah, spot on match. Hey, what are the odds? And the niece, they couldn't find anything in the paternal line that would be 100% a guarantee. But he was identified. The body was eventually identified through his mother's line, which I'm absolutely fascinated by. But I think after it's all said and done, Richard III's body was eventually buried in all places in the cathedral at Leicester. So perhaps the cathedral that took the place of Greyfriars all those years ago became Richard's final resting place. And it's a very unassuming tomb. When you go, and I urge anybody that ever makes it to London, go to Westminster, walk through there. You can stand on Charles Darwin's grave. He's there. They're buried in the floor. Isaac Newton's there. But go seek out these royal burials because they're very ornate, complex. But this one man who had a life that was cut short, literally, that lived with palace intrigue, and that lived under the shadow that he was a monster, born with a curved spine, and always having to fight uphill his entire existence until he is brutally butchered on a battlefield in Bosworth. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed Human.